In the history of aerial warfare, there is no name that commands more respect and more terror than the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It is the most produced fighter in history. It birthed the highest-scoring aces to ever breathe oxygen, men like Erich Hartmann, who claimed 352 kills. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, a sleek silver bullet designed to reclaim an empire's pride. But behind the propaganda posters and the gleaming metal lies a statistic that chills the blood. 90% of the pilots who sat in its cockpit never saw the end of the war. The Bf 109 was a paradox. It gave its pilots the power of a god, but it demanded their lives as a down payment. It was a plane that could outclimb anything in the sky, yet it would murder its own pilot on a routine landing. Today, we are decoding the system errors of the Messerschmitt 109, the horrors that the Luftwaffe tried to hide, and the reason why being the best in the world often meant you were simply the first to die. To understand the Bf 109, you have to understand the panic of the early 1930s. Germany was under the suffocating restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. They were banned from building a military air force. So, they did what any outlier would do. They lied. They built civilian planes that were actually war machines in disguise. When Willy Messerschmitt sat down to design the 109, he had a radical, almost suicidal philosophy. Wrap the smallest possible metal skin around the biggest possible engine. While the rest of the world was still flying fabric-covered biplanes with open cockpits and fixed wheels, the Bf 109 arrived like it was from the future. It was an all-metal, low-wing monoplane with retractable gear and a fully enclosed canopy. It was essentially a high-performance racing car with guns. In its first public debut at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, it dazzled the world. It set speed records of 610 kilometers per hour. The message was clear: Germany was back. But the world didn't see the engine paradox. The first prototype actually flew with a British Rolls-Royce engine, because the German ones were still failing. It was a machine built on borrowed parts and forbidden dreams. Most fighter pilots are afraid of the enemy. Bf 109 pilots were afraid of the ground. Because Willy Messerschmitt wanted the wings to be easily removable for transport, he bolted the landing gear directly to the narrow fuselage. This was an aerodynamic masterpiece, but a mechanical nightmare. It made the wheels sit dangerously close together. During takeoff, the massive torque of the engine would pull the plane violently to the left. If a pilot wasn't perfect with the rudder, the plane would ground loop. It would spin out, flip over, and crush the pilot inside. The math of failure. Roughly 1,700 Bf 109s were lost to landing and takeoff accidents alone. That is 10% of every plane ever built, destroyed before they ever saw a single enemy bullet. 1,700 pilots died or were maimed on their own runways. The Luftwaffe essentially ran a continuous execution of its own trainees just to get the planes in the air. When the war began in 1939, the 109 outclassed everything. But in 1940, it met its match, the British Spitfire. On paper, they were equal. But the Bf 109 had a mechanical edge. While the British used carburetors that would flood and stall the engine during a steep dive, the 109 used fuel injection. This created a G-force cheat code. A German pilot could simply push the stick forward and enter a vertical dive. The fuel injection kept the engine screaming, while the Spitfire pilot behind him would see his engine cough and die. For 3 years, this was the 109's get-out-of-jail-free card. But even with this advantage, the 109 was suffering from a strategic glitch: range. During the Battle of Britain, the 109 was a short-range interceptor forced to play the role of a long-range escort. Pilots had exactly 15 minutes of combat time over London before their fuel lights started blinking. If they stayed for 16 minutes, they would end up at the bottom of the English Channel. Hundreds of elite pilots died not from Spitfires, but from the simple, brutal math of a fuel tank that was too small. We need to be candid about the vulnerability of these pilots. Unlike the American P-47, which was a 7-ton tank in the sky, the Bf 109 had about the same armor protection as a modern subcompact car. The 109 used a liquid-cooled engine. It was efficient and sleek, but it had a glass heart. A single rifle bullet from the ground hitting a coolant line was a death sentence. Once the fluid leaked, the engine would seize in minutes. There was no limping home. You either bailed out or you crashed. And bailing out of a 109 was its own special horror. The canopy didn't slide. It was hinged on the side. At high speeds, the wind pressure made it nearly impossible to open. Pilots had to jettison the entire canopy, roll the plane upside down, and fall out, hoping they wouldn't hit the tail on the way down. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the star of Africa and Germany's greatest hero in the West, died this way. His engine failed, his cockpit filled with smoke, and as he bailed out, his chest struck the tail fin. He was dead before his parachute could even try to save him. But the true horror of being a Bf 109 pilot wasn't technical, it was biological. In the Allied Air Forces, if you survived 25 or 50 missions, you went home. You became an instructor. You survived. In the Luftwaffe, there was no rotation. You flew until you died, were captured, or were too mangled to sit in a cockpit. This is why German aces had 300 kills while Americans had 40. The Germans had 10 times more opportunity to die. One German squadron lost 100% of its pilots, then lost all the replacements, and then lost the replacements for the replacements. By 1944, the 109 was an aging dinosaur. To keep it competitive against the new American Mustangs, the Germans added heavy cannons and rockets. This destroyed the plane's balance. It became a pendulum in the sky, swinging wildly and losing the very maneuverability that kept the pilots alive. In the final months, as the Reich crumbled, the Luftwaffe made its darkest move. They formed Sonderkommando Elbe. They took 300 young volunteers, put them in 109s, stripped of all armor and most weapons, and gave them a single instruction: ram the bombers. It wasn't officially a suicide mission, because they were told to try to bail out after the collision, but the math was clear. They were human missiles. In one afternoon, 8 B-24 bombers were downed by 109s slamming directly into their cockpits. It was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter that proved the 109 had moved from a weapon of war to a weapon of national suicide. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 killed 30,000 enemy planes. It was the deadliest fighter in human history, but it was also a machine that hated the men who loved it. It was a miracle of engineering that served for 30 years, from the Spanish Civil War all the way to 1965 in some nations. But for the 90% of German pilots who were swallowed by the war, the 109 wasn't a legend. It was a cramped, oil-smelling box that they were never allowed to leave until they were dead. If you see a 109 in a museum today, look at that narrow landing gear. Look at the tiny cockpit. And remember that technological superiority is meaningless if you treat your pilots like disposable batteries. If the story of the high-tech trap changed how you see the Luftwaffe, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that the human cost of these machines shouldn't be forgotten. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We decode the world's most incredible military outliers every single week.